The choir room's echoes. In the heart of a sleepy town surrounded by misty forests, St. Michael's Chapel stood as a relic of the past. Built in the early 1800s, it was known for its grand stained-glass windows and a once-renowned choir that could send shivers down your spine with the purity of their harmonies. But behind its beauty lay a dark and unsettling history, one that began with the rigid and exacting Father Elias. Father Elias was a man whose devotion to God was matched only by his obsession with perfection. He took great pride in his choir and believed that their singing was the purest form of prayer. Under his leadership, rehearsals were grueling and unforgiving. He drilled the choir relentlessly, often demanding they sing the same hymn over and over again until it reached what he considered heavenly perfection. But Father Elias's pursuit of flawlessness hid a dark side, his anger. Choir members lived in constant fear of his temper. A missed note or an offbeat could result in scathing rebukes or humiliating punishments. The event that set the stage for the haunting occurred on a stormy winter night. The sky was a swirling mass of dark clouds, and the wind howled through the narrow streets like the cries of lost souls. Despite the tempest raging outside, Father Elias refused to end the practice session. The choir was exhausted, their voices trembling with fatigue, but Father Elias insisted they continue. The hymn they were practicing was one of his favorites, a mournful, haunting piece that seemed to echo the sorrow in his own soul. As the storm intensified, the old church creaked and groaned, its ancient timbers straining against the wind. Lightning flashed, illuminating the dimly lit room in bursts of harsh white light. Father Elias was in a rage, shouting at a young soprano who had faltered on a high note. His face twisted with anger, his voice thundered through the room, drowning out even the storm outside. Suddenly, he gasped, clutching his chest. His eyes went wide with shock and pain as he collapsed, his hand still outstretched as if to berate the choir one last time. The choir members rushed to his side, but it was too late. Father Elias died there on the cold stone floor, his last breath escaping in a whispered curse. After Father Elias's death, the church fell into a somber silence. The choir disbanded, and the once lively chapel became a place of whispers and shadows. The choir room, once filled with music, now stood abandoned, its walls holding the echoes of sorrow and rage. But the story didn't end with Father Elias's passing. Over the years, those who dared to enter the choir room reported strange occurrences. The temperature would plummet without warning, and the sound of faint, discordant notes would drift through the air. Some claimed they saw shadowy figures moving in the corners of the room, while others felt an oppressive presence watching them from the darkness. The most unsettling tales came from those who heard the organ play by itself, a deep, mournful tune that sent chills down the spine of anyone nearby. The notes were off, dissonant, as if played by hands unsteady with rage. The climax of the haunting came one Christmas Eve, a night meant for celebration and joy. The church, which had seen fewer and fewer visitors over the years, decided to hold a special midnight service in a bid to bring the community together. The remaining choir members, now much older, agreed to reunite for one final performance. The service was packed, and the atmosphere was heavy with a mix of nostalgia and unease. As the choir began to sing, everything seemed to go smoothly at first. But then, as they reached the second verse, an eerie change swept over the room. The air grew colder, and the candles flickered, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. Then it happened, a voice joined in, a deep, resonant baritone that sent a collective shiver through the congregation. It was a voice no one had heard in years, but all recognized, Father Elias. His voice rose above the others, singing the hymn with terrifying intensity, every note laced with anger and bitterness. The choir members froze in fear, unable to continue, as the ghostly voice filled the room. The organ played on its own, accompanying the voice with a dirge-like melody. Panic spread through the congregation as the lights flickered and the temperature dropped even further. Some claimed they saw a shadowy figure standing in the choir loft, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. The voice continued singing until the final note, then stopped abruptly, leaving the church in an unnerving silence. The candles extinguished themselves, plunging the room into complete darkness. When the lights came back on, the choir members were in tears, some trembling, others muttering prayers. No one spoke as they fled the church that night. After that Christmas Eve, the church was sealed off, and the choir room was left to rot. Locals say that on stormy nights, if you stand outside the church, you can still hear faint echoes of a hymn carried on the wind, along with the angry voice of Father Elias demanding perfection from a choir that no longer exists. The Haunted Confessional. In a small, isolated village, the Church of St. Augustine was a place of refuge and solace. The villagers, most of whom were devout, would regularly attend Mass and confession, seeking spiritual guidance and forgiveness. The church, built centuries ago, was a towering stone structure with dark, narrow corridors and stained glass windows that depicted scenes of judgment and redemption. But beneath its holy facade lay a chilling secret that revolved around the confessional booth and the tragic tale of Father Mateo. Father Mateo was young and idealistic when he was assigned to the parish. He quickly became beloved by the villagers for his kindness and willingness to listen to their problems. He took his vows seriously and was known to spend hours in the confessional, offering comfort and absolution to those in need. But it was within those wooden walls that Father Mateo's faith would be tested in ways he could never have imagined. One evening, as the sun set and cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets, a man entered the church. He was gaunt, with wild eyes and a face etched with fear and madness. Without a word, he slipped into the confessional booth. Father Mateo took his place on the other side of the screen and asked the man how he could help. What followed was a confession that would haunt Father Mateo until his dying day. The man spoke in a low, raspy voice, detailing unspeakable acts of violence. He described in gruesome detail how he had lured his victims, innocent villagers who had gone missing over the past months, into the woods and ended their lives in ways too horrific to describe. As the man confessed, Father Mateo felt an overwhelming sense of dread. His heart raced, and cold sweat beaded on his brow. But despite the terror gripping him, he was bound by his vows to keep the confession a secret. The man's confession continued for what felt like hours, each word dripping with malice. He spoke of voices in his head, dark forces that drove him to kill, and a hunger for blood that would not be sated. Father Mateo could barely breathe as he listened, his mind racing between his duty to God and the horror of what he was hearing. When the confession finally ended, the man leaned close to the screen and whispered, "There will be more. Pray for them, Father. Pray for me." And with that, he slipped away into the night, leaving Father Mateo trembling in the darkness. After that night, Father Mateo was never the same. The knowledge of the crimes weighed heavily on his soul. He became withdrawn and distant, spending long hours alone in prayer, pleading for guidance. But sleep offered no respite, his dreams were filled with blood and the faces of the victims. Whispers followed him wherever he went, echoing the man's confession, and the once comforting presence of the church became suffocating. The confessional, where he had once offered forgiveness and peace, now felt like a prison. Weeks passed, and Father Mateo's condition worsened. He grew pale and gaunt, his eyes hollow and ringed with dark circles. The villagers noticed his decline but could not understand the cause. Then, one fateful morning, Father Mateo was found dead inside the confessional. His body was discovered slumped in the booth, his face contorted in an expression of pure terror. His hand clutched a rosary, the beads pressed so tightly that they left deep indentations in his skin. The cause of death was never determined. Some said it was a heart attack, others claimed he had been frightened to death. But those who knew the truth whispered that he had been consumed by the darkness he had kept hidden. After his death, strange occurrences began to plague the church. Parishioners who entered the confessional reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. The air inside the booth was thick, almost suffocating, and many claimed to hear faint whispers just beyond the screen. The voice was low and menacing, urging them to confess everything, in a tone that sent shivers down their spines. The whispers grew louder as the years passed, and the confessional became a place of fear rather than forgiveness. One night, a young woman, burdened by guilt over a terrible mistake, entered the confessional hoping for absolution. As she began to confess, she noticed something was wrong. The voice responding to her wasn't that of the gentle priest she expected. It was harsh, almost mocking. The voice accused her of sins she hadn't committed, twisting her words and filling her with a growing sense of dread. Frightened, she tried to leave, but the door seemed to stick, trapping her inside. The voice grew louder, hissing and whispering sins in her ear, until she finally managed to break free. When she looked back, she saw that the confessional was empty. The priest had never been there. The villagers began to avoid the church at night, especially the confessional. It was said that Father Mateo's tormented soul was trapped within those wooden walls, forever haunted by the sins he could not absolve. The darkness he had tried to contain had claimed him in the end, leaving behind a cursed place where the line between the living and the dead had blurred. To this day, the confessional remains untouched, shrouded in dust and shadows. The church stands as a reminder of the dangers that lurk within even the holiest of places. Those who dare to approach after dark speak of hearing faint cries and whispers carried on the cold night air, a warning to all who enter that some sins are too terrible to remain hidden. The ghostly bell ringer. In the center of a bustling town, the Cathedral of St. Peter's stood tall, its spires reaching toward the sky like fingers grasping for heaven. For centuries, it had been the heart of the community, a place where weddings, funerals, and Sunday services marked the passage of time. But towering above the cathedral was its most iconic feature, the bell tower. The bells, once the town's timekeepers, had fallen silent many years ago, their joyful chimes replaced by an eerie silence. Few remembered why the bells were no longer rung, but those who knew the tale spoke of a tragedy that still haunted the tower. Nearly a century ago, the bell ringer was a man named Thomas. He was a solitary figure, devoted to his duty of ringing the bells at dawn, noon, and dusk. The townspeople knew him as a quiet, reliable man who had spent most of his life tending to the bells. Despite his humble position, Thomas took great pride in his work. The rhythmic chime of the bells was his voice, a way for him to connect with the community that largely ignored him. But Thomas's dedication hid a deep loneliness. The isolation of his job, climbing the steep, narrow stairs multiple times a day, had taken its toll on his mind. He spent more time in the bell tower than with other people, and over the years, the tower became both his home and his prison. The tragic event that sealed the tower's fate occurred on a bitterly cold winter's night. A fierce snowstorm had rolled in, and the streets were deserted, save for the flickering lamplights casting eerie shadows on the walls. The cathedral was empty, except for Thomas, who, despite the treacherous weather, dutifully made his way up the winding staircase to ring the bells for evening prayer. But something was different that night. The air in the tower felt heavy, and the normally solid steps creaked underfoot as if under strain. Thomas dismissed the feeling as a result of the cold, his breath visible in the frigid air as he climbed higher. As he reached the top, he prepared to pull the ropes, but before he could, he felt a cold draft sweep past him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he sensed someone, or something, watching him. He spun around, but the room was empty. Ignoring his growing fear, he began to ring the bells. The sound echoed through the storm, but with each chime, the air grew colder. Suddenly, a shadow flickered in the corner of his eye. Thomas turned to see a figure standing in the shadows, a man, dressed in ragged clothes with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. The figure's face was twisted in a mixture of sorrow and anger. Thomas backed away, but there was nowhere to go. He could feel the figure's icy gaze boring into him, and then, without warning, the shadow lunged at him. In a moment of panic, Thomas slipped, losing his grip on the rope. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on the edge of the staircase. In his final moments, he saw the shadowy figure reach out as if to grab him, but instead, he plummeted down the stairs, his scream swallowed by the storm outside. His body was found the next morning, broken and lifeless at the base of the tower. The official report declared it an accident, but those who knew the history of the cathedral whispered that something far more sinister had occurred. After Thomas's death, the bells fell silent. Attempts to find a new bell ringer failed, as anyone who took on the job quickly quit, claiming they felt an unsettling presence in the tower. Some reported hearing footsteps following them, others swore they saw shadows moving in the corners of their vision. The townspeople grew uneasy, and eventually, the tower was sealed, its bells left to rust in silence. Decades passed, and the story of Thomas the bell ringer became a ghost story told to frighten children. But time has a way of blurring the lines between history and myth. That was until the cathedral's new management decided to restore the bell tower. They believed the story of the ghostly bell ringer was nothing more than superstition and hired workers to repair the old structure. Among them was a young man named David, who was fascinated by the history of the tower. Despite the warnings from the locals, he volunteered to take on the role of bell ringer once the renovations were complete. On his first night in the tower, David was eager to begin. The newly restored bells gleamed in the moonlight as he made his way up the staircase. But as he climbed, he noticed the air grew colder with each step, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, twisting unnaturally. Reaching the top, David took a deep breath and pulled the rope. The bells rang out, their sound clear and crisp, but as the chimes echoed, he heard something else, a low whisper, barely audible over the bells. "Leave." David froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, louder this time, accompanied by a cold gust of wind that extinguished the lantern he had brought with him. In the darkness, David felt something brush against his back, a touch so cold it sent a jolt of fear through his body. He spun around, but saw nothing but shadows. Then, the bells rang again, this time on their own. The rope moved as if pulled by invisible hands, and the sound was distorted, the notes clashing in a jarring, discordant melody. Panic gripped David as he backed toward the staircase, desperate to escape. But before he could descend, a figure emerged from the darkness, a ghostly apparition of a man with hollow eyes and a face twisted in pain. It was Thomas. The ghost stared at David with a mix of sorrow and anger, his form flickering like a candle in the wind. With a trembling voice, David tried to speak, but the ghost raised a hand, pointing toward the bells. "They must not ring," the ghost's voice echoed in David's mind, filled with a deep sense of dread. In that moment, David felt an unseen force push him backward. He stumbled, lost his footing, and fell down the stairs, crashing into the cold stone below. The townspeople found him unconscious at the base of the tower the next morning. When he awoke, David was pale and shaken, muttering about the ghost of the bell ringer and the warning he had received. He refused to return to the cathedral, insisting that the bells should remain silent forever. Since that night, the bell tower has remained untouched. The bells are rusted and broken, left to decay as a reminder of the tragedy that befell Thomas and the curse that haunts the tower. The townspeople say that on stormy nights, when the wind howls through the streets, you can hear the faint sound of bells ringing in the distance, a ghostly echo of the past. And if you listen closely, you might hear the mournful voice of Thomas, still guarding the bells from beyond the grave, ensuring that they are never rung again.